What this conference is about is while there is a great deal of history set in the Midwest, prize-winning books, field-changing books, very few of these people actually identify themselves as Midwestern historians. I think that's a distinction worth pondering. I think it raises a larger question, which is, why not Midwestern history? Why are there so many intelligent, well-trained people writing books and articles set in this region who seem reluctant to identify themselves as historians of the Midwest? Well, those, ladies and gentlemen, are the words of Drew Caton, spoken from this stage last year when John Lauk, the co-host of this conference, and I were talking about this year's conference, our second Midwestern conference. We wanted to dedicate this conference to Drew. He had been here, and just a couple of weeks after he left us, he discovered he'd come down with cancer and passed away. So this is why this is very much a memorial tribute to Drew. I'm Gleaves Whitney. I direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University, and I am very happy to be your co-host today, along with John Lauk and the Midwestern History Association. John, where are you? I think right there. Let's give John a hand for all the work he's done. And while we're giving shout-outs, I want to say that a number of people help make conferences like this possible. This is by no means a one-man show. It's by no means a one-organization show. I want to thank our donors to Grand Valley and the Hauenstein Center. I want to thank all of our speakers who've contributed. I want to thank some of the local people who've really gotten involved in this conference. We're so pleased to have Mary Seeger and Joellen Clary and others who have really adopted this as a forum to expand our awareness of local history, regional history in the Midwest. Pleased with all of their efforts. And I want to thank you in the audience for coming. I mean, you chose to come to this event, and we're just delighted that you've chosen to join us. I think it's going to be a very enlightening day and evening. It's going to be a long day. Let me just close with a couple of more quotations from Drew from last year. There seems to be an impulse to get respect from people on the coasts, from the real historians, and to ask why somehow there isn't more respect for the kind of history that we all identify as the Midwest. My grandmother used to say to me, Drew, look, if you want people to listen to you, the first thing you have to do is listen to them. And I would urge you all to do a little bit more of that. That is, do less caricaturing of the real historians and the people on the coasts. We've heard almost as much mocking of them as we've been quoting people about the Midwest. And finally, he said, quoting Drew Caton, take critics seriously. Get beyond being defensive. You have to make a positive case. How does knowing something about the history of the Midwest change the history of the United States or change the history of the continent and the globe in a particular kind of way? Think about why. Think beyond those of us in this room who love the Midwest, why anybody should care about this history. Well, that's our duty today, is to make the case why we should care about Midwestern history and the significance that we know it holds for us and for our country and for a broader global context. Well, with that, I would like to bring up Joe Hogan, our program director for the Common Ground Initiative, and he will be introducing our initial keynote speaker. Joe?
Thanks, Gleaves. As Gleaves just said, and as you all know, we're here today to help revitalize the study of Midwestern history. That's the sort of academic undertaking that requires serious and compelling scholarship, to be sure, but it also demands something else, namely a bit of savvy, a sort of entrepreneurial spirit, or a willingness to forge new, uncharted paths in scholarship. Andrew Seal, this morning's speaker, is among the scholars who are helping to clear new pathways in Midwestern history. At the same time, Seal's unique ability to merge his writing on the Midwest with his writing in another field, that is, the recently revitalized intellectual history of the United States, makes his work stand out as an example of thought leadership. Above all, Seale's work makes clear just how much might be gained from the intersection between Midwestern and intellectual history, two fields that are undergoing an exciting revival at the same time. Currently a doctoral candidate in American Studies at Yale, Seale is at work on a dissertation titled The Almost Century of the Common Man, Democracy and Heroism in U.S. Thought and Politics, 1880 through 1960. In it, he takes up the thought of leading Midwestern historians and thinkers such as Merle Curti, whose ideas about intellectual history centered on growth and commonness, and were, in this way, markedly Midwestern. As a staff writer at the award-winning blog of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History, Seale has brought much-needed attention to the idea that Midwestern intellectual history, and particularly the thought of Curti, has championed, quote, the relentlessly asymptotic process of closing the gap between elite and common knowledge. This egalitarian vision of Midwestern intellectual life, of the growth and democratization of knowledge, encapsulates the spirit of Midwestern history as it's been propagated by so many of the scholars in attendance today. A contributor to the Middle West Review and publications such as the Chronicle Review, N+1, and In These Times, Seale is helping to map the landscape of Midwestern intellectual history for historians and educated non-specialists alike. We're very pleased he's here to kick off our conference. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Andrew Seale.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you so much. And thanks for that introduction, Joe. The regrowth of American thought. I'd settle for the regrowth of Andrew's scalp. Now, the title of my talk today is an homage to Merle Curti's 1943 The Growth of American Thought, a book he completed a year after he moved back to the Midwest to take a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison after a long sojourn in the East. Curti was well known for the uncommon diversity of his interests. As one of his students put it, his coterminous attention to dime novels and John Locke, world fairs and educational policy, from peace movement history to early forays into women's history, from American philanthropy abroad to democracy on the frontier. As many tributes and eulogies to him have pointed out, the OAH's Merle Curti Award has either been split between an intellectual history and a social history, or has alternated between those two fields ever since it was first given to Henry May in 1978. Quote, Curti's historical writing is so diverse that on first glance it seems to lack any common themes, the intellectual historian Paul Konkin noted. That is not quite true, he goes on to say. Quote, from first to last, he tried to understand and evaluate the cultural achievements of Americans, all of them, through all their history. Oh, well, only that. In fact, Konkin offers another possible candidate for the clearest theme in Curti's historical writing. That theme was democracy, and it was an ethical commitment as much as it was a topic or subject. Democracy, as Konkin reconstructs Curti's views, quote, requires for everyone an opportunity for fulfilling participation in collective life, not only in political choice, but also in education and above all in economic management. The concrete realities of life must, above all else, fulfill the ideal of equal worth, even for those with limited abilities. From the elementary school curriculum on up, people should have a real, effective, informed voice in the decisions that most affect their lives. By this type of social involvement, by participation in the choice of both means and ends, more and more areas of life can partake of artistry and yield a type of beauty. But how does one write about this vision of democracy? We might take note of the fact that Curti wrote a larger number of synoptic histories than any other major US historian. More histories that stretch from the colonial or revolutionary era to the 20th century. He wrote a history of patriotism that does this, and a history of educational theories. 2 books about the history of ideas of human nature, one just about American historians' notions of human nature, and then one about everybody else's. How many monographs do you see with the dates 1636 to 1936? That was the span of his study of peace movements, which was actually published in 1936. He wrote textbooks and a guide to US history for immigrants seeking to become American citizens. And he wrote The Growth of American Thought, which didn't need dates in the title because it included it all, including tentative but very important discussions of both indigenous and African cultures. It is in the meaning of that title that I think we can catch a glimpse of how Curti thought to write a history of democracy. And it also gives us our first glimpse of why I think both Midwestern and intellectual histories are seeing a revival today. The growth of American thought meant 3 things to Curti. It meant a holistic approach, but not necessarily a unified approach. We can perhaps think about 2 other titles of contemporary intellectual histories for context. Ralph Henry Gabriel's 1940, The Course of American Thought, and Henry Steele Commager's 1950, The American Mind. Both draw upon an image that channels or contains its subject matter. The intellectual content runs through a single course or is encompassed by a single mind. Curti's title, on the other hand, permits a certain looseness. It is cohesive enough to be about American thought, but it does not insist upon the unity of Gabriel or Commager. Growth is a more open-ended metaphor. Growth also meant expansion, increase, accumulation. Curti pays attention throughout the book both to the way that knowledge grows as more research is completed and more fields of research are created, and also to the way the intellectual infrastructure of the nation thickens and increases its signal strength, able to reach more people both within the United States and beyond its borders. One of the core ideas of the book is simply that its subject is not quality of thought, but quantity of thought. Over time, more Americans have been able to spend more of their lives in active contact with their own thoughts and with the thoughts of others, and the thoughts by Americans have grown to reach more of the world. The growth of American thought operates somewhat like compound interest. We benefit, all of us, from the minutes our grandmothers scrounged to read an improving article in the newspaper, or the moments our fathers snatched out of the day's end to argue a point of politics with a coworker or a friend, perhaps even with our mothers. Because knowledge for Curti is social. It accretes. Curti's idea of thought resembles the ethos of Wikipedia, almost 30 years before the first email was ever sent. The third meaning of growth is a bit different. He writes, "The gulf between the knowledge of the intellectual and that of the common people has always been wide, everywhere, but it has been less wide and less deep in America than elsewhere. In this fact, perhaps, lies the unique characteristic of American intellectual history." End quote. Growth means the closing or filling in of knowledge gaps, of intellectual inequalities and asymmetries, the meeting of minds with different bases for their ideas and different ways of knowing. Because for Curti, growth isn't unidirectional, the trickling down of elite ideas to non-elite readers or listeners. Both sides advance, perhaps unevenly, perhaps uncertainly, to bridge this gulf. Growth is a melding, an amalgamation, an imperfect fusion. Curti's idea of growth was not just expansion, but the closing of gaps between the powerful and the disempowered, the knowledgeable and the knowledge-starved. An open-ended holism, accretion and expansion, an imperfect fusion. This is a vision of the United States and of thought which is, I think, if not natural, at least more congenial to traditions in both intellectual history and in Midwestern culture. Intellectual history works best under presuppositions or axioms which stress not so much continuity, but commonality. Intellectual historians speak of a climate of opinion, or a temperament, or a spirit of an age. Our work presumes that ideas are contagious, and that the biggest ideas, modernity, romanticism, individualism, freedom of thought, progress, liberté, égalité, fraternité, Beyoncé, are like pandemics, mutating a bit as they expand over a territory, but generally displaying the same symptoms, loosely uniting a population, something like that thing we refer to as the common cold, the cold that is shared communally. But this is also a vision that Midwesterners tend to cherish and to see as distinctive of this region and its people. We imagine ourselves as rooted, but also mobile, fond of expanding and fond of drawing together, both extroverted and a little laconic. How's it going? We'll call to our neighbor and leave it at that. Our historians have imagined us not like the Brahmins imagined Boston as a hub, central but stationary, but as a confluence of forces and flows, a middle ground, a middle border, the center of a great empire, the valley of democracy, our largest city as nature's metropolis, the convergence point of commodity chains and rail lines. Indiana is proud to call itself the crossroads of America, and even the pejorative label flyover country emphasizes the centrality of movement, of crisscrossing routes like ribbons drawn through our skies, reminding us as we trace the contrails through the clouds of the few hours that separate those passengers, their destination, their point of origin, and us. Curdy saw the history of American thought as one of growth because he had counted the mile markers between his native Nebraska and New York City. But he also saw it as growth because he knew they were only mile markers, not chasms. There is no enchanted forest separating Columbia University and Columbia, Missouri, just a lot of truck stops. So why is this pertinent today? Why, if I'm right, are many Americans now expressing a felt need for this vision of history as growth? And why, furthermore, am I arguing that this vision is behind the recent revival of intellectual history and Midwestern history? And the rest of the time I want to talk briefly about the recent past, that is, the last 40 or so years, and how both intellectual historians and Midwestern historians have seen it. And then I want to suggest that new work, some of it in history and some of it not, offers a return to something older but now or still very much alive, something which Midwestern history and intellectual history can offer, if not uniquely, then at least abundantly, successfully, truly. The commanding framework for thinking of the last 30 or so years of intellectual history is Daniel Rogers's concept of the age of fracture, which he developed in a book of that name from 2011. The title is a little incautious, although in groundbreaking works of this sort, perhaps caution is itself foolhardy. But it's a little reckless because it risks sounding like the rather sloppy pontifications of Robert Putnam, whose bowling alone became a catchword. But Rogers, in fact, makes clear that his subject is not the breakdown or even the fraying of the social fabric. Instead, Rogers argues that what frayed was a public language for talking about the experience of and life amidst social structures. Quote, social structures persisted, he writes. Still, what changed were the ideas and metaphors capable of holding in focus the aggregate aspects of human life as opposed to its smaller, fluid, individual ones. End quote. We began to use metaphors that projected not collective notions of life, but individualized attachments, achievements, or images to describe the basic features of existence. These processes we no longer thought of as, properly speaking, social. They were not about making a community, a nation, a spiritual body, a union, a company, or a class. They were instead about making ourselves, about making choices that revealed or tested or reconfigured or paraded our identities, our uniquenesses. To caricature the point, Rogers argues that we no longer became familiar with the question, what kind of world do I want to live in? We asked instead, whom do I want to be today? Alongside fracture, Rogers uses another word to name the dynamic at play over the last 30 or 40 years, disaggregation. Compared with the era that had gone before it, quote, one heard less about society, history, and power, and more about individuals, contingency, and choice. The importance of economic institutions gave way to notions of flexible and instantly acting markets. History was said to accelerate into a multitude of almost instantaneously accessible possibilities. Identities became fluid and elective. Ideas of power thinned out and receded. Elsewhere, Rogers speaks of a disaggregation of society and its troubling collective presence and demands into an array of consenting, voluntarily acting individual pieces. But disaggregation means a little more than the cruder, clumsier word fracture. Disaggregation suggests a sort of modularity, a sort of consciousness of self that cleanly segments one facet of identity from another, that dices a career into episodes of employment, that imagines decisions as being neatly squared off and isolate, uncontaminated by ramifications or repercussions. An item, a vase, a sculpture, a bone, can fracture and yet maintain its original shape, more or less. Disaggregation is dismemberment. Dismemberment and modularity are good metaphors for the methods of the corporate raiders who were the chief anti-heroes of at least one decade of the age of fracture. And the economic order over which they presided is the one that David Harvey and Frederick Jameson and Perry Anderson have analyzed as postmodernity. I've noticed a sharp, though unremarked, downturn in focused discussion around the concept of postmodernism, perhaps because we have gotten used to the word neoliberalism. I want to return to this more cultural side of postmodernism in a moment, but here I am talking about the political economy that has been defined by, as Rogers put it, flexible accumulation, with its much shorter time horizons, much shallower institutional investments, and global extension. Or, in more concrete terms, outsourcing, offshoring, financialization, the massive shift from a manufacturing to a service economy. Or as Frank Sabatka says in the television show The Wire, you know what the trouble is, Brucey? We used to make shit in this country, build shit. Now we just put our hand in the next guy's pocket. The disorientation which workers in the manufacturing sector, their families and their communities, felt as the ground dropped out from under their feet has been well chronicled in such books as Jefferson Cowie's Staying Alive, but perhaps even more famous than these accounts is the theory of false consciousness or misplaced priorities, which supposedly explains why the working class responded to deindustrialization by voting Republican en masse. This theory, captured most memorably by Thomas Frank in What's the Matter with Kansas, arrived on the scene more than a decade after the onset of the second major intellectual historical framework for these years, the culture wars, covered most comprehensively by Andrew Hartman. But what Tom Frank did so well in that book was to naturalize the emerging notion of a red America and a blue America as the obnoxious product of the culture wars. He demonstrated, to many people's satisfaction at least, that the heated rhetoric of the early 90s had permanently altered or realigned the entire nation into waging a sort of permanent electoral trench warfare. Now that really is fracture. Hartman's account of the culture wars differs from Rogers, mainly in that Hartman sees the right-left split as one of the most salient features of American society in those years, while Rogers is skeptical that the blunter forms of ideology were really so determinative. But Hartman also diverges from Rogers in seeing something more than, as in Rogers' phrase, a contagion of metaphors at stake in debates over poverty or school curricula or AIDS. Intellectuals entered the fray because they wanted to possess something and to keep others from possessing it. The meaning of America, and I would add, the meanings they could make out of their lives in America, the emotions they could feel without shame. Hartman argues that the cultural and political upheavals of the 1960s had left liberals and progressives feeling rather satisfied that, quote, post-60s American culture represented a closer approximation of its ideal form, while the right considered it an abomination. Consolidating or reversing those changes, Hartman argues, was not a sideshow to real economic struggle. It was about seizing possession of the intellectual means of production for the nation. Hartman's book, War for the Soul of America, has taken criticism primarily for his conclusion that the culture wars are over. Just look, his critics say. Look at North Carolina and its petty warfare on transgender people. Look at those cake shops refusing service to gay couples. Look at Bree Newsom's act of civil defiance, snatching the Confederate flag from the pole on the grounds of the South Carolina State House. What is going on there, if not a culture war? But if we are to take the ethos of the Donald Trump campaign and those who are responding to it seriously, as we absolutely should, I think we see a confirmation rather than a disproof of Hartman's contention. We forget, well, my liberal and progressive friends often forget, that in the culture wars, the right absolutely saw itself as the good guys, the heroes, and they took their positions without shame, not because they could not feel shame, but because they believed that their positions were the morally right ones. Many people have called Donald Trump shameless, and that is perhaps his most salient feature. He is not telling the crowds who come to see him that their cause is morally just or divinely sanctioned. He tells them what he's going to do and leaves the moral calculus to others. What we see in the Trump campaign is an admission among certain parts of the right that the left's arguments about many, not all, cultural issues have the moral high ground. But they say their cause is above or beyond morality. It is a struggle for survival, and all is permitted. They don't care much about being on the right side of history, because as they believe, history might very well end for them and their way of life. I'll leave you with that sobering thought for a moment. But for now, I want to return to that third way of framing the last 30 or 40 years, postmodernism as a kind of cultural mode, one typified by irony and other forms of meta-humor, and by a fascination with simulacra and surfaces, with concepts of things rather than the things themselves. And also with a sense of belatedness, of living out the residue of a stronger, thicker, more self-possessed kind of life, a life with anchors or roots, with parameters known and secure, family, church, work, retirement, neighbors, banks, offices, or shop floors. Everything seemed to have become a concept of something else, rather than something of its own in postmodernity. But these concepts were not prototypes because the thing it conceptualized, stood in for, had already happened. We held not plans of the future, but aftershocks, imprints, traces of the past in our hands. These three frameworks for understanding this period profoundly affected the Midwestern self-image and self-consciousness. They profoundly affected Midwestern historians. Let me give an example. A number of Midwestern historians gathered in Oxford, Ohio in October 1998, convened by the late Andrew Caton, whom we're honoring. Some of you may remember this. The gathering was called Writing Regionally. Historians talk about the American Middle West. And the essays read there were reshaped into a book published in 2001 by Indiana University Press titled The Identity of the American Midwest, Essays on Regional History, edited by Caton and Susan Gray. It was in many ways the culmination of a period of efflorescence in Midwestern history, largely driven by Caton's energy, his immense knowledge, and his ample collegiality. A parallel and contemporary surge in the study of Midwestern literature was similarly helmed by David D. Anderson. Much of the scholarly resources and monographs upon which we now draw for our work was published in this 11 or 12-year period. Such classics of Midwestern studies as Caton and Onuf's The Midwest and the Nation, the Dictionary of Midwestern Literature, James Shortridge's The Middle West, Its Meaning in American Culture, Ronald Weber's The Midwestern Ascendancy in American Writing, John Tieford's Cities of the Heartland, and work by Gray, John Gerda, Catherine McNichol Stock, Douglas, I'm sure you know all this, Douglas Hurt, Kathleen Niels Consett, many, many others. The spirit that I see working behind these works, particularly the Caton Gray volume, was very much a product of these three intellectual frameworks that I have sketched out: fracture, culture wars, and postmodernism. Although in some ways, these historians swam with the current, and in other ways, they rowed against it. Leaning against these trends toward fluid elective identities, there was an obvious yearning among them for a heavier, more tangible regional identity, for open declarations and explicit theorizations of the Midwest as a real thing, as what Susan Gray referred to very eloquently as a story written in the blood. They betray a great admiration of Southerners and Westerners who possess a few doubts about the solidity of their region, and some impatience with historians who write about the Midwest without writing about it. As Caton said, virtually none of these studies, which refer to the Midwest but aren't identified as Midwestern histories, offers a formal, rigorous consideration of the Midwest as a cultural entity. Scholars study gender or law in Illinois without the self-conscious regionality of people who write about gender and law in, say, South Carolina or New Mexico. They focus on what amounts to relatively universal questions of race, religion, gender, ethnicity, class, and political structures in a featureless setting. They are studies of life in the Midwest, not of the Midwest itself. End quote. For there was, after all, an irony embedded here. The Midwest was supposed to be so traditional, so grounded, and yet in its lack of any fixed, thick, concrete identity, it was the most quintessentially postmodern of regions. The larger context of the rise of identity politics created an intellectual economy, especially in the academy, in which having a sharp-edged identity at your disposal was absolutely necessary. One had to have a noun which would fill in the blank. Well, speaking as the Midwest's rather postmodern insubstantiality precluded this kind of self-declaration. And so the answer was to condense Midwesternness into something that could be molded into an obvious, inarguable, keenly honed identity. But if the Midwestern historians were pulling against this tide of postmodern fluidity by asserting their claim to a more solid identity, they ran with the current by expressing a desire to disaggregate from the national and the universal. The burden of being the most American of regions troubled a number of the contributors to the book, especially the two editors. Quote, "This sort of identification of the Midwest with American civilization was a cliche even in Frederick Jackson Turner's day," Susan Gray wrote, "and this cliche, quote, is a major reason why the Midwest remains the most understudied region in the United States." Historically, Caton added, when people in the Midwest argue with each other over questions of identity, they fight over issues on universal, national or local levels. Midwesterness, when it is invoked, he argued, is either cursory or general. We might summarize his complaint as saying that Midwestern identity is like a horoscope, specific enough to get you believing in it, maybe even to give you temporary comfort, but vague enough that you have to check it every day. There is no sense of permanence. It is particular enough to get you feeling a little special, but not so concrete that you know what to do with it or about it. Midwestern historians, Caton, Gray, and some of the others implied, needed to stop playing at astrology and start treating the Midwest as if it had, quote, a particular constellation of attitudes or behaviors. Lines had to be drawn, decisions made. Some things were Midwestern, some things were not. The Midwest was not the nation, it was not the world. Universalism was undesirable. This accounts, I think, for the painfully earnest debates we are all familiar with about edge or limit cases of which states are or are not part of the Midwest, which writers or politicians are defined by their Midwesternness, and who only lived here for a while. But just as the larger context of postmodern identity politics shaped the desire to assert the definiteness of a Midwestern identity, the disaggregating trends of the age of fracture shaped this yearning for an identity that sheared off from the national, that couldn't be claimed as another universalism, that was determined by, and not just decorated with, its own peculiar quirks and idiosyncratic folkways. More concretely, I think this refusal of universalism related to the experiences of deindustrialization and of the farm crisis. Even though the fates of Flint and the family farm were connected to global economic upheavals and political policies that were sweeping over much of the world, the Midwest felt as if it was experiencing these traumas alone, and it demanded that its experience be regarded as unique, special to Midwesterners and Midwesterners alone. Even though disaggregation was a new rule for so many aspects of life in so many places around the world, Midwesterners stipulated that the crises of the 80s and 90s were their personal tragedies. This possessiveness was expressed in many ways, but in none more commonly than in the idea of the Rust Belt, a containing metaphor, one that asserted that the only people who really suffered losses at that time lived in a geographically banded area. But the metaphor of the Rust Belt also spoke to that characteristically postmodern sensation of belated life, of existence dragging on after life itself has drawn to a close. We used to make shit in this country, build shit. We had entered the years of rust, when the machinery was never cleaned or oiled or maintained because it was now shuttered, defunct, unplugged. We rusted, or felt like we were rusting. The aspect of Midwestern history in the 1990s which spoke to this sense of belatedness was its fixation with Frederick Jackson Turner. Susan Gray apologized to her fellow panelists at the 1998 symposium by saying, "I hope that no one will mind yet another paper devoted in part to Turner." And she justified this return to him by saying, "Although the new Western historians have long claimed Turner as their demon familiar, he has as much ours as theirs, if not more so. Indeed, it was the vigorous exorcisms of Turner from the new Western history at the hands of Patricia Nelson Limerick, Richard White, and more ambivalently, William Cronin, that seems to have inspired the new Midwestern historians. These Western historians and their works are constantly referred to both for theoretical insights and historiographical guidance. But Turner meant one thing to the new Western historians and a very different thing to Midwesterners. What he meant to the new Western historians can perhaps best be summed up in the subtitle of Patricia Nelson Limerick's major work of 1987, The Legacy of Conquest, the unbroken past of the American West, or in the irony coding the title of Richard White's 1991 synthesis of Western history, It's Your Misfortune and None of My Own. What both historians stressed in their works was that the myths of the American West were, by and large, myths of disconnection, of closure, of things passing away never to return. Bad stuff happened, these myths admitted, and rough men did rough things. But that was then, and it's none of my misfortune and none of my fault. We have no debts to pay, no guilt to feel. This is insidious, Limerick and White and others, like Richard Slotkin, argued. Turner was wrong, even culpable, in forging the myth of the frontier's close, because that myth permitted us to see the injustices of the frontier process as part of a cleanly anterior prehistory to our world, one we could mark and celebrate in whatever way we chose. No, that history was unbroken, uninterrupted, and the forms of racialized oppression that shot and sickened and starved the Indians off their land had direct descendants living among us. That was not the Turner that the new Midwestern historians confronted, although they did confront that as well. His crime was still myth-making, but it was a different myth. This Turner sold the nation on the myth of the universal Midwest, as a section uncomplicated by distinguishing marks, a palimpsest of national trends and troubles, flat, featureless, and impressionable. Turner simplified the Midwest by downplaying or obscuring its diversity and its complications, cutting out the portions that did not make it a paragon of national history. It was Turner's fault, in short, that there was not a Midwestern history the way there was a Western history or a Southern history. Now, alongside Limerick's indictment, this accusation is small potatoes. But I think the new Midwestern historians somehow wanted to keep the Turner who preached the frontier and its closure. Because who more than Turner stood for a career spent evoking that palpable belatedness, which Midwesterners again felt in the 1980s and 1990s. Turner's identification of the 1890 census as the closing of a great historic movement resonated with the sense of Midwesterners in the 1980s and 1990s that the motors of change and progress had been switched off. Rust is a compelling image for this sense of belatedness, of living not just after the golden years, but of living in a place that history had moved on from. Rust is a natural process, but it seems somehow less benign than organic processes, like the rotting of wood or the spread of weeds. Rust appears to us hostile, not just decrepit, defiant and not just regenerative. It is a way that iron tells us that we were arrogant and now we have failed. But rust also signifies the magnitude of the past, and it literally obscures the details of that past underneath its oxidized crust. Rust evokes an automatic nostalgia for the pre-rusted state. Now, that nostalgia did not characterize the new Midwestern studies of the 90s and early aughts. Their point, it seems to me, was more that all regions need a regional historiography, and the Midwest had, at best, a vestigial one. While they acknowledged that Midwestern history had been neglected as a field, they focused more on the internal complexities and paradoxes of what it was to have an identity as a Midwesterner than they did on the academic and cultural politics, which pushed other concerns to the forefront of the public mind. But there also was a barely perceptible, never fully articulated sense in the histories written in this era that most of the history that was going to happen in the Midwest had happened, that we had missed our chance for something really defining and grand, and that we had better start tallying up the score. That sense of completion has continued, I think, within many of the recent works, which are overtly nostalgic, such as Edward McClellan's 2013, Nothing But Blue Skies, the heyday, hard times, and hopes of America's industrial heartland. The last chapter of the book sees the author return to his high school in Flint, possibly a subtle nod to the spirit at work in Bruce Springsteen's 1985 single, Glory Days, which originally had a verse, later cut, about Springsteen's father, who worked in a Ford plant in New Jersey. The glory days of high school and the glory days of Motor City interlink. In Robert Putnam's newest book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, he also returns to his old school, to Port Clinton, Ohio. My hometown, he tells us, was, in the 1950s, a passable embodiment of the American dream. While he offers many more solutions to the crisis that he sees than does McClellan, Putnam seems convinced that any solution, no matter how successful, will basically be a salvage operation, a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. The epigraph of the book's first chapter is, I went back to Ohio, but my city was gone. The refrain of the Pretenders song about Chrissy Hines' Akron, a song released at about the same time as Springsteen's Glory Days, and in the same year, 1982, as John Cougar's Jack and Diane. Ooh yeah, life goes on, long after the thrill of living is gone. Now, Springsteen tells us that the problem with tales of glory days is that we repeat them. And as historians, we don't really get to cut off our stories simply because the thrill is gone. Thomas Wolfe was almost right. You can't go back to high school. I'm certainly not arguing that there is no room for the personal in Midwestern history, nor am I arguing that there is nothing left to say about the heyday and hard times of the Midwest. Excellent work continues to come out about deindustrialization, the breakdown of organized labor, the depletion of farm-owning families, the hollowing out of Midwestern small towns, including McClellan's very vivid, insightful book. One does not have to be as sanguine as Robert Wuthnow was a few years ago in Remaking the Heartland, where he praises community downsizing and the growth of large-scale agribusiness. There is instead room even for bitterness in our histories, no matter what Barack Obama says. But what I think will be detrimental to the further growth of Midwestern history and Midwestern studies, more generally, is an abiding concern with defining our field, with giving it solidity and a clear shape, sharp edges, a firm identity, with giving it a clear, absolute narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. This firm basis for our unity as a field will come, I am afraid, at the expense of those two ideas that were cut out from earlier attempts at making a field. Midwestern history's capability of standing in for national history, even universal experiences, and its ongoingness, its continuity with the present, the ideas, you may notice, that lay at the heart of Merle Curdy's writing. The Midwest may or may not be America's most American region, but it is certainly the region that, I would argue, mixes the American past and present with the greatest complexity, that has the most and strongest connections between the social order of the present and the social order we have come to think of as traditional. We can, I would argue, see fossilized in our present more of the past than in other regions, and we can see in our past more harbingers of the present, more, at any rate, than we often look for when we fix our eyes only on what is now gone, imagining ourselves as living out a belated existence. And our lack of sharply distinguishing features, our slender generalities, which are all we can cling to as an identity, are not a curse but a blessing. It means that we have at our feet a field fertile enough for hundreds of squatting scholars, interested in life in the Midwest, but not in Midwestern regionality. We can host them, trade with these academic coureurs du bois, and not charge them with poaching. We can make our history a commons rather than a cemetery. And I think we can do this because it is already being done. Dozens of monographs and studies of the Midwest, not all of which are histories, are leading the way, not only as insightful analyses of important topics, but as purposeful departures from the entangling morass of the age of fracture and the culture wars and postmodernity. They see connections rather than contingencies, wholes rather than fragments. They seek out histories not, as many new social historians did, to throw back the enormous condescension of posterity and reveal the tragic inspiration locked in the ephemeral success of some political or economic alternative. Instead, these scholars gravitate to histories that overtly explain the roots of recalcitrant problems that we continue to face. The point is not so much widening our political imagination, our sense of what is possible, but of focusing our collective intelligence on the correct etiology of our maladies, its right places to start in addressing the underlying issues. Some examples. Matthew Desmond's recent Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, which looks closely at the structure of rents and evictions across lines of race and class in Milwaukee. While it is not a history per se, its top to bottom, holistic scope represents the aspirations of this kind of scholarship. Similarly, the award-winning Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic by Sam Quinones, takes up the small, decaying Ohio town of Portsmouth, not to tell a closed history of the future running out, but rather of the future arriving too fast in the shape of heroin and prescription painkillers. Ohio is at the center of international collisions of power, money, and violence, not at the dead end of a golden age. Kristen Hoganson's forthcoming work on the Urbana-Champaign area and its position within a number of transnational commodity chains promises to be one of the most sophisticated studies of its type and a strong refutation of the myth of Midwestern insularity. Cutting things a little short, I'll just list a few other people who are doing incredible work: Beryl Satter, Andrew Highsmith, William Marola and Heath Carter in labor history, Christopher Phillips, Timothy Stewart Winter, Kathleen Mapes, and the writing, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, of Eula Biss, fantastic writer. But there is also one more thing, I think, flowing silently through many of these studies, and it takes us full circle to Curdy and to the reasons why Midwestern history and intellectual history are experiencing renewed interest. And that is that they depend upon a resurgent sense of the common, the shared, the basic, the factors which are intrinsic to being alive and to being alive amongst other people and to solving the problems that come with that condition. Midwestern history, like Curdy's intellectual history, can be a history of growth. And if it spills over the geographic borders which we think constitute the Midwest, so be it. Let us focus on the connections we can make rather than the lines we can draw, the definitions we can agree upon. The current revival of Midwestern history has, I think, been far less concerned with a priori definitions of Midwestern identity. I think this bodes very well for our future. But I think we also need to be aware, and I feel this keenly as an intellectual historian, a field that has a reputation for stuffiness and a sort of territoriality, that the success of our field depends on how useful our work is to others. It is not enough to tell someone that they are really doing Midwestern history. In fact, they may not even have good results. Let us instead reach out and demonstrate where our work connects with theirs, how we are already in conversation. For the historiography of the Midwest is incredibly rich, as John Lauk and David Brown and others have shown in a number of studies, and it has already been deeply intertwined with not only other regions' histories, but with histories of race and labor, gender and sexuality, immigration and capitalism. We are the crossroads of America, and even of global history. Let us grow in all directions. Thank you. I think I'll take questions now. If you'd like, please come to the mics at the front or just stand where you are. Yes, Wes.
Yeah, so really great talk. I really like your ideas of stress and connectivity. I wonder if you could just talk briefly about, especially in terms of labor history, this trend to have a declension narrative. To always end the study with labor lost out, organized labor is on the downfall. And so I've been seeing a lot of people really push back on that in terms of social movement history, labor history. Do you see any kind of connection there between stressing this connectivity in Midwestern history and the pushback from declension narratives?
Yeah, I think declension narratives were very common for a period of time, in part because of global conditions, but also I think because of particular intellectual influences. You know, the influence of E.P. Thompson and other labor historians gave a particular kind of narrative which was imitated and admired so thoroughly that I think that it became standard, and other narratives that may not have fit in as well were sort of shoehorned into that form. I think that in many ways we are experimenting with the form of narratives now in many ways. Things don't have to have the same shape that they used to. And I think that that's a very productive development. Yeah, yes, here.
What would you say is this role of gender in these new studies that focus on the shared and the common?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that one of the breakthroughs has been the concept of intersectionality. And so thinking of gender and race and class and sometimes immigration status in connection. So I think that the concept of intersectionality has opened up ways in which all of these concepts can be implemented within the same narrative, within the same story, and added to that regionality. So I think that there's a way in which this particular intellectual history of the concept of intersectionality has been of immense use to historians trying to make those connections and trying to layer their stories in a way to really cover multiple dimensions of human experience. Yes, of course.
A lot of women's historians feel that gender and women's history gets lost to to race, ethnicity, regionality. What do you think?
I think that that's certainly a danger. In my own work, I'm writing on the history of the common man. And it's not a term that's used by a lot of women. And so without, surprise, surprise, right? Mary Ritter Beard sometimes talks about the common woman, but that phrase is also not commonly used. So it's been very difficult to find enough women's voices, and the men's voices that I'm finding are not thinking about gender in very sophisticated ways. And so without actually bringing in women's voices, you often lose out on discussion of gender, which is a real problem, and is a fault in the sources and a fault in ourselves, I think. Yeah, John, you had.
In terms of this distinction between elite culture versus the common man culture that Merle Curdy talked about, and some of these other Midwestern historians, can you talk about the role of Merle Curdy's life in the Midwest, his being raised in Nebraska, and how that plays into his later philosophy of the common man?
Yeah. So I've read a number of tributes, and some of them stressed his Midwesternness and others didn't. David Cronin compiled a great bibliography, and he said that Curdy had a somewhat ambivalent, a very deep sense of sympathy, but until he got back to Wisconsin, he didn't think about region as much. Paul can probably tell you more than I can about that. He's been in the Merle Curdy papers, and I haven't been able to visit them yet. So my sense is that once he became the Frederick Jackson Turner Professor at Wisconsin, he was deeply immersed and embedded in the Madison ethos, and that is a particular strain in Midwestern history that has its own idiosyncrasies, I think, as we probably all know, and its own points of emphasis. I think that in some ways he was more of a Madisonian than a Midwesterner writ large. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that that's where a lot of his ideas sort of moved into and came from. Yes?
It's been argued that the communications revolution, the internet and so forth, have hit the Midwest harder than other regions, partly because we seem to lack the clarity that other regions have. On the other hand, I think one can make the point that that revolution in communication may in fact be the Midwest's salvation, so to speak. I wonder if you could take a look at those two somewhat contradictory thoughts and make some sense of that.
So how does the new communications revolution, the internet, affect social media, affect Midwestern identity as promoting it or sort of hampering it? That's a really great question. I would have to think about that for a while. I think that it can do both. I think that certainly it has facilitated gatherings like this in ways that I think the historians who gathered in 1998 simply did not have. Email was around, but I'm not sure how many were using that instead of letters to facilitate the organization process. If anybody is a veteran of that gathering, I'd love to know. But I don't know how many of you are on Twitter or something like that, but it can enable collectivities, collective experiences and actions that are really fulfilling, I think, in many ways. At the same time, it can feel very placeless. And so I think that the placelessness that we often feel as Midwesterners can be exacerbated by that. So I don't know. I think we'll have to sort of wait and see. One of the founders of Google is a Michigan alum, right? So I think that there will have to be some histories about how, or sociological studies about how the Midwest has played into some of these roles. I mean, we think of it as only located in Silicon Valley, but that's not really true, right? There's many high-tech companies in Michigan and around the Midwest that are active contributors in terms of this communications revolution. So we'll just have to find out more, I think. The results have to come in. Thanks. Yes, John.
I had an encounter with Merle Curdy as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. I had two professors at Missouri who were PhD students of him, so I knew who he was. And he was always hanging around the library and the Historical Society. And one day, he came over and started talking to me because he recognized me hanging around. And I never had the courage or, chutzpah to go talk to him or strike him. I never talked to him again. But the question is, how can a guy who was that friendly and took the time to talk to somebody who he didn't know from Adam, do all the stuff that he did? I mean, all these synthetic works, is it just, today, most of us, or some of us, feel like we have a hard time just carving out a little area, maybe in our own state,
Yeah.
And do you have any I'm very impressed by the range of references you have in your speech today. And do you have any recommendations for how we can, do this without just, being 2 inches deep in our studies?
Yeah, if you find out, let me know. I think that what's really amazing about his studies is that there's not a lot of repetitive material from one to another. I think that he had, some ideas that really took off and became other projects that emerged out of things like the growth of American thought. Another work, he edited this really fascinating collection of a guy named Elihu Burritt, who was the learned blacksmith, a real example of working class self-education in the 19th century. Early on, he was doing a lot of work on American interest in the revolutions of 1848, and that almost became his dissertation, I believe. But then he left that at his advisor's recommendation. But that became parts of other books that he wrote later. So I think that he had an amazing retention of facts, and I think that he had such deep interest in these little corners of history that he was able to weave them together, like nobody else could. And so I think that he had a very solid understanding of the shape of American history in general, but I think that he also had these passions where he really put down pilings very deep down into American history, and he connected those very, very skillfully.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, great, yes.
Can you speak about the place of African Americans in the literature or studies on the Midwest?
Yeah, great question. I think that this is another aspect where it's been a sort of specialized field, I think, and has not been in dialogue as much with the rest of Midwestern history as it should be. And I think that the concept of intersectionality, again, can really help that. So I mentioned Andrew Highsmith's book, Demolition Means Progress, which is about Flint. And that brings race and class into conversation in a really complex and interesting way. And I think that we'll be seeing many more histories like that, where I think that the experience of African American communities within the Midwest becomes part of the dominant narrative, the master narrative of the Midwest in the 20th century and the 19th century. And so I look forward to many more studies like that. But I think that that's where the field has to go. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes.